Good morning and welcome to I-24 News Morning Edition. It's the 28th day of Operation Protective Edge and we are on a special broadcast this morning. Israel has declared a 7-hour humanitarian truce for today across the Gaza Strip, except for East Rafah. It's set to take hold at 10 a.m. and end at 5 p.m. The Hamas spokesperson Sami Abu Zuhri responded to this IDF's declaration of the truce, saying it's a unilateral act which is designed to, quote, divert attention from Israel's acts of slaughter. Meanwhile, Israel was slammed for allegedly striking a UNRWA school, killing 10. The IDF says it fired on terrorists on motorcycles near the school and that was looking into the incident. The IDF also partially redeployed in and around Gaza as it neared the end of its work demolishing Hamas tunnels, and a Palestinian delegation held talks yesterday on the ceasefire arrangements in Egypt. Also yesterday, the Givati Brigade officer Hadar Golden, killed in Gaza on Friday morning in a Hamas attack, was laid to rest yesterday. He's the 64th IDF fatality. Gazan health officials put the death toll there at some 1,800. With me this morning is the former Foreign Ministry Senior Deputy Director General and the former Senior Ambassador, Mr. Pinchas Avivi. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. I-24 News Senior Middle East Analyst Ali Waked. Ali, thank you. And I-24 News Diplomatic Correspondent Tal Shalev. We're going to get a quick update now from I-24 News correspondent Yoav Borovich. Yoav, you are standing by in Ashdod, of course, a city that has seen code red sirens just this morning, of course, despite the unilateral ceasefire that's supposed to come up very soon.
Good morning, Yael. Yes, 2 hours ago, Iron Dome intercepts a rocket really here above the city. Siren alerts here. Also yesterday, 2 people are injured from mortar shells very close to the city. We're here near the city hall. We talked to the city hall, even to the city hall employees. They said the situation really here is really bad. It's a city center, almost no people in the street. 2 hours the ceasefire is supposed to start, but people don't have hope in the process, don't have hope in the leadership. This is a city that even in periods of calm suffers from rockets and mortar shells, as you said. Obviously now last few weeks, much more than that, but there's a sense that things will not stop. We see her projects, building buildings, but the real estate prices really plummet here in the city. People don't want to move into Ashdod, and this is what really concerns the people. With this situation, of course, we'll be here following all developments, see what's happening with the ceasefire and how it will influence the southern towns of Israel. Stay with us.
Yoav Borovich, I-24 News correspondent there in the south of Israel. Thank you, of course, for joining us. Tal, I want to start with you. There is going to be IDF did announce a ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire. Yes, it is unilateral, meaning Hamas has rejected it, or what is the idea behind this humanitarian ceasefire?
Well, from Israel's point of view, it doesn't matter if Hamas rejects it, if Hamas accepts it. This it's a unilateral ceasefire because Israel has moved to some kind of unilateral mode in the past few days, not even waiting for Hamas to respond to anything. That is at least the outspoken policy. But in any case, this, of course, follows a very, very harsh day yesterday of international criticism regarding the shelling of the UN Rafah school. Yesterday, I think, from Israel's point of view, was a tipping point. From the international community's point of view, there was unprecedented wave of criticism with very harsh words. And this is something that has been on the table inside the Israeli Security Cabinet meetings, even before this event. But you can see that the international community is losing patience and is not, probably seems not to be willing again to accept this kind of damage to civilians and death toll rising of civilians just for some targeted missions that the IDF has decided to accomplish. And that was one of the tipping points that did lead to the humanitarian ceasefire today. Israel does understand that it has to show some humanitarian face, and the death toll is rising, and the crisis in Gaza regarding the humanitarian situation is growing by the day.
So the rhetoric issued also by the U.S. State Department, also by the UN, and of course world leaders in Europe, which has been mainly quiet up until now. This is a tipping point in terms of also international credit, perhaps.
Well, yes. I think yesterday the international community, it's not the first time Israel has bombed, has shelled a UN school, giving a justification that there has been rocket fire from nearby or from inside some kind of UN facility. But the international community has been saying again and again, stop, stop, stop. This is not acceptable. And yesterday, I think these international communities said, enough is enough. How many times can we tell you that this is not the price worthwhile to pay from the international community's point of view? And I do think that led to the decision today to impose the humanitarian ceasefire. On the ground, we'll have to wait and see how exactly that will last, what will be the reaction from Hamas, and will this have any impact on the talks in Cairo that at this point are going on without immediate or direct Israeli presence, but Israel is behind the scenes all the time in constant contact with the Egyptian counterparts.
So what was the language used mostly by the United States, which of course over the weekend we saw completely different language when Barack Obama made his statement over the weekend. It changed very quickly after the UNRWA school was bombed.
That's the thing. I don't think that the language yesterday from the State Department, it was disgraceful and indefensible. We had a wide range of American officials harshly condemning, using very harsh language. But I don't think that actually resembles anything regarding the tension between Israel and the U.S., or not primarily, but rather the growing international concern from the humanitarian situation. And as we said, some kind of anger. It's real anger with Israel. Why isn't the IDF being more careful? But of course, if the relationship between the Obama administration and Netanyahu government was in a good days at the moment, as we know they're not, that probably the statement could have been a bit more delicate and a bit more subtle.
And we're also, of course, 28 days into the fighting. Ambassador Avivi, you look at the last 28 days, and one will say, yes, there was some kind of international credit that was given to Israel. Do you see now, as Tal has said, a tipping point in terms of the international credit?
Might be, because I can tell you that including the 28 days that we have the possibility to act with some kind, I don't say support, but without a direct attack on Israel and a full understanding of what is happening, we saw that it's really too much. And when you're calculating an operation, you have to take in consideration that you don't have all the time that you want, but you need to use the maximum possible in minimum days if you don't want to fall into an international attack. So it was expected, especially when something like that happened. And the fact that the military authorities don't give yet an answer why it happened means that they also understand that maybe it wasn't, maybe they have a good explanation, I hope so, but somehow it affected very much the other possibilities of Israel to continue.
And meanwhile, Ali, of course, Palestinian delegation was in Cairo yesterday without the Hamas military wing. Will the Hamas military wing now use this incident, for instance, also as their own kind of tipping point within the Palestinian factions?
This is the big question, and we still do remember what happened Friday morning when the political level of Hamas a couple of hours ago, before the incident of the attack at Rafah and trying to kidnap a soldier, Khaled Mashal in person gave the UN and the US Hamas engagement, Hamas promise to respect the ceasefire, and we saw how the military wing reacted. What is happening in Cairo is that Gaza at all, political and military, is not represented. It has some impact over the level of conditions of the Palestinian delegation. The Palestinian delegation that is not suffering like the people in Gaza need to present a tough position vis-a-vis the Egyptians and vis-a-vis the Israelis, and to show the military wing and also the political level in Gaza that they are keeping their interests, they are representing their suffering and their agenda. Yesterday evening, for the first time, the delegations met with some representatives of the Egyptian intelligence, presented them the 7 or 8 points of the Palestinian delegations, which I think for Israel would be very hard to swallow most of the point, because it is true that the ceasefire factor comes at the head of the paper, but when you read the whole items, you see the whole conditions, you see that the ceasefire is only a very small part of the Palestinian paper. There is a whole demand that I'm not sure that the Egyptians can swallow. I'm not sure that the Egyptians can transmit even to Israel, and we are going to assist today a typical Mediterranean market in which both sides will try to bargain, and as Tal said, the Israelis Israelis are permanently in behind the scene, coordinating with the Egyptians, and I don't think that what we are going to see from the Palestinian side today in Gaza is a reaction to what Israel do against the tunnels or doesn't do, but a reaction to what is happening in Cairo and the progress that will take place in Cairo.
I also don't think that the U.S. at least is signaling that it's not putting too much hopes, or at least not publicly putting too much stakes at these at this stage at the talks in Cairo, because at first the representatives, the U.S. administration envoy was supposed to be the Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns, but then that level was lowered to Frank Lowenstein, who is one of Kerry's assistants, meaning we're not at the point yet of a breakthrough, and that the Americans understand that too. But there is growing pressure. And yesterday there was a report in the Egyptian Al Ahram citing Egyptian and European sources saying that they do not really understand the mixed messages coming from Israel. That on the one hand is saying that it's no longer seeking ceasefire, but on the other hand keeping constant contact with the Egyptians. There is Israel is in some kind of blunder, and you can already read today Israeli officials in the Israeli media saying we're in a diplomatic mess. It's not clear how we can leave at this point.
But with regards to this diplomatic mess and what Ali is saying that are under demands, Israel's not there physically in Cairo, but they are, of course, behind the scenes. What demands of Hamas are able to be negotiated by Israel, or is it absolutely nothing?
Well, Israel has been saying, first of all, the Egyptian initiative. The Egyptian initiative talks about, first of all, ceasefire for 48 hours, right, and then speaking about other demands and long-term negotiations. At the current proposal and draft proposal of the Palestinians, that's not the case. It's 4 or 5 conditions. One of them is ceasefire, and the other ones are long-term solutions, something that even the Egyptians, as Ali said, might not be able to present to the Israelis. But Israel's primary demand, and that is a more significant or substantial one, is to link any reconstruction of Gaza with disarmament of Hamas. And that at this moment, there's no mention of disarmament in the Palestinian draft. That will probably be the Egyptian challenge in the upcoming hours and days.
If I can add something,
Please.
If something is really scared to death Hamas, is the possibility that Israel will take unilateral steps, will decide alone what will be the future of the situation. They don't want to be in a situation in which the end of the war will be without any positive result for them. Another thing that scares them very much is not only the coalition, a very important coalition that exists today between Israel and Egypt, it's the beginning of some coalition in the Middle East that put them aside. So they will try to do everything in their hand in order to force us to come to the table. And
But at the same time, diplomatically, you look at Israel's coalition, and Netanyahu said this 2 nights ago during his press conference. He was praising the regional partners that Israel does have. It's very clear also who are the regional partners that Israel doesn't have. We look at Qatar, we look at Turkey, and we hear yesterday, of course, the Prime Minister Erdogan, who's going to be perhaps elected very soon to president, speaking very harshly, maybe unprecedentedly, about Israel.
Yes, but you have to remember that Erdogan party, AK party, is precisely the mirror of the Islamic Brotherhood parties in the Middle East. Erdogan, in many conversations, including that I had with him in the past, when I was ambassador of Israel in Turkey, said that the fact that Hamas was elected in a democratic way forced us to take them in consideration and accept it. I many times told him that election is not the way you become Democrat. In order to become Democrat, you have to recognize and to fulfill all the other conditions of democracy. They were elected, yes, but they didn't accept any part of the democracy. He in any way see the possibility that if they will be thrown out after being elected, the same thing will happen to him in the future in Turkey. So he's not defending Hamas. He's defending the AK party and he himself in Turkey.
But when you look at, of course, the regional players, and if Israel is dragged into another conflict like this in the next 2 years or so forth, as many in the Israeli public feel, who will be there guiding Hamas? Hamas will still have these patrons, if you will. Qatar as one. Turkey perhaps as another.
I personally believe that we can rebuild the good relation between Israel and Turkey. I had the opportunity to talk some months ago out of Israel with some very important person from Turkey. who is in the center of the decision. And I told him, when we have the problem in Syria in between us, when we have the problem in Egypt in between us, when we have the danger of Iran becoming nuclear in between us, it's simply a lack of responsibility for our next future generation if we will not do anything in our hand in order to improve the relation between us. I personally believe that he understood it. I think that the majority of the people in Turkey, I'm not talking about the crowded people in this appearance of Erdogan are representing the society in Turkey. Look, practically if you are looking about economy between the countries, at the beginning of 2000 we had $1 billion import-export. Today we are talking about $4.5 billion. It means something. It means for them as well. So I personally believe...
Despite the rhetoric we're hearing from Erdogan just yesterday?
He did nothing in order to somehow affect the... And he spoke in the last year also about the possibility of buying gas from Israel. So
you were also ambassador, of course, in South America for quite a while. Another continent perhaps that was overlooked by Israel in this past conflict, maybe caught the Israeli Foreign Ministry by surprise, the amount of antagonism and quite frankly, taking the diplomats back and so forth, Brazil leading the way. Was this a surprise for the Israeli Foreign Ministry?
Somehow, yes. We know in the last year we understood that the majority of the minorities of Islamic people in Latin America. I will give you one number only. In Chile, for example, you have 350,000 Palestinians, all of them from Bejala, Bet Sahur, and Bethlehem. Once I took the numbers, I saw that there are much more Palestinians from Bet Sahur, Bejala, and Bethlehem in Chile than in Bet Sahur, Bejala, and Bethlehem. It means something. They're all very much involved in political affairs in the country, and they're influential in the parliament as well. So it took us in surprise because of the timing. It took us in surprise because we understand that if Chile, Brazil, Ecuador, and other countries want to be influential, they need to have good contact with Israel. You can't be influential without being present.
Right.
And the ambassador is the best mechanism in order to be influential. So the fact that they took out the ambassador is ununderstandable, especially when it happened in the middle of a process that both Latin America and Israel did in the last year in order to improve the relation. I had the opportunity to meet with the ministers of foreign affairs of all the American continent less than 2 years ago in Guatemala. And in that meeting, they talked about the importance of Israel being present in Latin America in order to help them in the most important challenges that they have today, sustainability especially, agriculture, education, managing water, things that are very important for them. So while we are in the center of such an important positive operation, while we are trying so much to rebuild the good relation between Israel and Latin America, yes, it was surprising.
What, is it a bump in the road, or is it going to be long-standing now? Is it going to be hard to mend these relationships?
Well, we'll do our utmost in order to rebuild the relation. We still remember that Latin America is the most important continent that was responsible for the 29th of November decision. They were the countries that voted for us. We will never forget that. During the year, we did our utmost to curate a very good atmosphere. Maybe in the last year, because we opened many news embassies, especially in Europe after the falling of the Iron Curtain. It affected somehow our presence in Latin America. But if it depends on us, we are not taking into consideration only the local and bad feelings that we have today because of what happened. We will do our utmost to rebuild the contact, to do everything that the ambassador will come back, and to show them that the good relation between two parties are important not only for Israel but for them as well.
Indeed. I'm going to quickly go to I-24 News correspondent Charles Biebelser. Charles, you're on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning. What's the latest from there?
Good morning, Yael. Relative quiet, actually. As you know, the government has declared a 7-hour unilateral humanitarian ceasefire that's to take effect at 10 a.m. this morning. This is to allow goods to enter the Gaza Strip, as well as to allow residents from Gaza to return to their homes. This being said, Hamas has rejected the proposal, and as you know, earlier today there were 3 rockets fired into Israel, 2 of which targeted Ashkelon, one Ashdod, all of which were intercepted by Iron Dome. Israel has declared that it will respond to any breaches of the ceasefire, and we did just recently hear some artillery fire. That being said, the ceasefire, it's important to note, will not apply to the southern Gaza Strip, in particular the Rafah area, where the IDF continues its operations primarily against Hamas's terror infrastructure, the tunnels being the main target.
Thank you, Charles Biebelzer, there on the Israeli-Gaza border. Of course, you will be updating us throughout this morning's special broadcast. Tal, you had a question.
Yeah, I want to go back, Ambassador Bibi, to the Turkey issue. I'm wondering how both Turkey and Israel are both U.S. strong allies, one of maybe the strongest allies of the Americans in the region. So do you think the fact that the rift between Israel and Turkey is just going bad by the day and not getting any better in the past few years has something to do with the diminishing position of the states, of the United States in the Middle East? I mean, do you think, you would think that the United States would be able, or a strong United States, a strong Washington, a strong administration would be able finally to bring the sides together. That was what President Obama was trying to do more than a year ago, and he didn't have any results, any success at the moment.
First of all, I have to say that still United States is the most important power in the region, in the eyes of Israel, in the eyes of Turkey as well. The situation changed, especially when the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey decided about his neo-Ottomanism. And neo-Ottomanism means, by the way, to make much more relation with the neighborhood of the Arab state and Muslim state, and this affected somehow Israel much before the things that happened. I seriously believe that in the majority of the people, including in the Turkish government, do understand the importance of the relation. I do believe that the United States today is able to support us in order to rebuild the relation. I know about a lot of some kind of effort done by United States, but also done by Turkish and Israeli people in order to rebuild the good relations that we had. Some weeks ago, only some weeks ago, we had the feeling that we were close as that for renewing all the diplomatic relations in the level of ambassador as it was before. But nobody, but really nobody, can control Erdogan. While other people are speaking for the head, many times he's speaking for his stomach. It's not the same for his guts. It's not the same. And I believe that the attack on Israel today have much more to do with the election within Turkey than about the situation in Gaza. I didn't see Erdogan attacking Syria as much as he attacked us. I didn't see him saying anything about what is happening in Iraq. I don't recall any reaction of Erdogan about what happened in Darfur. This is a political movement he is doing before the election. Election will pass. He will not be the prime minister, thanks God. He was not able to transfer the power from prime minister to president, and I believe that after the election somehow people from Turkey and people from Israel, both understanding the importance of the relation, will do the utmost in order to rebuild the relation.
The economic implications.
Tal talked about the lowered representation of the Americans today in Cairo, and she asked Mr. Ambassador about the diminishing role that the U.S. is playing in the region. And I think, for example, this interest meeting between Israel and Saudi Arabia that is taking place without any serious and direct mediation of the United States. And talk that I had with one Egyptian diplomat yesterday, who says that he is expecting from the Israelis to load their declarations against any arrangement with the Palestinian Authority in order not to dismantle this coalition that is being built between Israel, Egypt, and some of the Arab Gulf countries. When the Egyptians, the Saudians, hear Lieberman and hear Bennett, they cannot stand aside defending this coalition, defending or accusing Hamas for being the responsible for this war in Gaza. There are some coalitions that are being built in this region that the foreign ministry in Israel, because of its foreign minister, is underestimating and doesn't understand how strategic it can be in the future. When the Egyptians read the reports about the position of Lieberman in the cabinet vis-a-vis the nature of the operation declaration or with an escalation or ban it, their motivation to continue defending Israel and accusing Hamas decreases, of course.
Ambassador?
The Minister of Foreign Affairs is not part of any party, and the official and the professional understanding of Israel is the coalition is very much important. That we have to do everything in our hand to support the coalition and not to attack the coalition, to combine our decision with Egypt if it's possible. We are not playing with or together with Hamas, but absolutely in every day of the week we are trying to understand what are the Egyptian position, how can we influence a good decision by the Egyptian. It's not that we are ignoring them, especially if you are looking at about the professional level, not only the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, the other institution in Israel. We all recognize the importance of the coalition.
But perhaps we're not taking the opportunity
to support it.
But perhaps we're not, what Ali maybe was saying is we're not taking the opportunity to use these good relationships that have been formed basically by geopolitical situations and taking advantage of it.
Never ever before in any government in Egypt we had such a good strategic conversation like we had today with Egypt. In the professional level of all the ministers, that I seriously believe, that Minister Lieberman do understand the importance of that coalition. There is a huge difference many times between political declaration for the parties and the professional decision, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs is doing while we are talking about the work of our ministry and the government of Israel. We are all, including the Minister, supporting the idea of a new coalition that might change completely the situation of Israel in the Middle East.
Ali.
By the way, Yael, Hamas and its supporters in the media, in the Arab world, are identifying this axe that is being built between Israel and especially Saudi Arabia, and they are focusing much of their attacks against Saudi Arabia, accusing Saudi Arabia of leading this international covering to the Israeli operation against Gaza. And two things need to be done by the Israelis: to lower the talks about the Saudi-Israeli coordination. One, to keep it as secret as discreet as possible, and second, to lower also the declarations against the massive destructions in Gaza, because we saw 3-4 days ago that the King Abdullah of Saudi was obliged to react against his own belief when he accuses Israel in creating war crimes. Well, the best case for Hamas, he is sharing the responsibility between Israel and Hamas, and the worst case for Hamas, he's accusing mainly Hamas for this round.
A fragile relationship at best, maybe a new opportunity, but fragile.
In the past, we assisted when the Israelis lost the opportunity to build something more sustainable with the Saudis.
We're going to end it here. We have to go for a 2-minute break. We'll be right back with more from the special broadcast of I-24 News Morning Edition. Thank you all for joining me. Ambassador Avivi, thank you for being here. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to I-24 News Morning Edition. We, of course, are in a special broadcast this morning. It's day 28 of Operation Protective Edge. Still with me in studio is I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev. Tal, thank you for staying with us. And the Bureau Chief of Defense News, Barbara Opel-Rome. Thank you, Barbara, for joining us. And the Foreign Affairs Editor of Channel 2, Arad Nir. Arad, thank you for being with us. Tal, I want to take off where we left off and then bring the new panelists into the discussion. We were talking about the coalition, both regional coalition, and of course we'll get also to the Israeli coalition. But when Netanyahu did talk about the regional unity in his press conference 2 days ago, he didn't mention anyone really by name. But it's very clear who we're talking about. And some of the criticism directed to him through Israel was the fact that he didn't mention Mahmoud Abbas, which is obviously one of the biggest strategic partners Israel could use during these days, especially having the delegation in Cairo.
Well, in the past few months, I might say, Netanyahu and many of his counterparts many of his colleagues like to talk about regional interests and, as we heard, new regional opportunities. And they tend to ignore the fact that any new regional opportunities has to link some kind of big political move towards the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. There is reportedly inside the Israeli cabinet, some do feel a change of tone towards Abbas in the past few weeks. Some of the more right-wing ministers that are used to attacking him are maybe moderating their tone, but it's not clear yet that Netanyahu has the will to really make a big political move towards Abbas. And when you read behind the lines, both the Europeans and the Americans are talking about any long-term solution that will be constituted in the Gaza Strip has to include a massive strengthening or boosting for Abbas. And it's not clear. Yesterday, the U.S. ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, gave an interview to Meet the Press, NBC Meet the Press. Many times, Dermer is considered to be Netanyahu's talking head, mouthpiece. He's one of Netanyahu's closest aides. And if you judge by what Dermer said, either he didn't get the memo that there's been a change of talking points towards Abbas, or this is what Netanyahu is really thinking. And I don't know if we can get
We'll see it in a second, but of course what Dermer is telling the American people is also a kind of a message from Netanyahu strictly to Obama.
Well, that's a big question. Is Dermer in line with the government's talking points? We can assume he is, or is he speaking what Netanyahu really wants to say, or is this really the official government stand? We might remind that inside the Israeli cabinet, Tzipi Livni, the chief negotiator, is pulling towards a direction that out of this crisis could emerge some kind of renewal of talks or renewal of some kind of diplomatic process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But yeah, let's take a look at what Dermer had to say.
And it was very telling that the Palestinian official would not actually condemn Hamas. His problem is he has to go back to Ramallah, and Ramallah right now, President Abbas, is in an alliance with Hamas. Let's remember what Hamas is. This is like Al-Qaeda. They're a terror organization. They're committed to our destruction. This is an organization whose officials were celebrating on 9/11 when thousands of Americans were killed, whose prime minister, who is right now underneath in some tunnel in Gaza, he actually condemned the United States for killing Osama bin Laden. That's who we're dealing with. And it was very telling that the Palestinian...
So yesterday, Netanyahu gave up his traditional weekly Sunday shows. In the past few weeks, he's been going every day. Netanyahu himself was on all of the American Sunday talking shows. Yesterday, he only sent Dermer, and that was the message that Dermer gave to the American public. And we still, we can talk later about Dermer and the relations between Israel and the U.S. at this point. But in any case, this stand that Dermer takes does maybe pose a big question mark behind the notion that there is a change of tone inside the Israeli government towards Abbas. Is Israel really willing to go the next step towards Abbas in order to create a long-term solution to this conflict?
But of course, Arad, when we look at Dermer's statements, we have to say it's also on the other side. The Obama administration yesterday condemning the UNRWA school bombing used also a different tone that hasn't really been used up until now.
Yes, all the condemnations yesterday stepped up a level. Condemnations without pointing on Israel, but the proof was there, and it was quite obvious whom are these condemnations directed to. It started with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, then America, also later on France came into this equation, and it's hard to perceive. The world finds it hard to perceive what is going on in Gaza. Now, talking about Netanyahu's policy, Netanyahu speaks about deterrence, he speaks about unilateralism. We are talking that, the general saying is that it takes two to tango. Mm-hmm. It takes two to deterrence. It takes to unilateralism as well. If you want to deter somebody, he has to be deterred. If you want to set the rules yourself, someone has to obey the rules that you are setting. And I think that Netanyahu does not have a partner in Hamas for any of these plans.
He may not have a partner within his own coalition for it.
Well, let's leave aside his own coalition. Okay. Now we are his first aim before the coalition. We Israelis, we are extremely tempted to drag everything into local politics. But before local politics, we have a problem in Gaza. Right. We have Hamas attacking Israeli citizens on a daily basis. And this is unacceptable regardless of local politics. So Netanyahu's point, maybe because of local politics, but as I said, let's put this aside, he wants to play it unilaterally. He wants to set the rules. The problem is that Hamas initiated this conflict because it had some goals. None of these goals have been achieved up until this very moment, and the Hamas does not seem to back off.
But Barbara, of course, the question is also what goals that Israel stated from the beginning have been achieved, and there seems to be a dissonance between what the military says it has achieved to what's perceived also in Israeli public opinion, also in world opinion.
Well, that's exactly what Arad said. It takes two to tango, but the one that is leading the dance needs to know what type of dance is it, does he know the steps, where does he want to go with this, and that's absent, and that has a ripple effect primarily on the IDF as it's achieving heroic and enormous, extraordinary tactical successes, unable to achieve strategic aims because the government keeps moving the goalposts. Also, we talked about Washington. Israel sets the tone in Washington still. And at this time, when we're not even clear what is the government policy vis-a-vis Abu Mazen, Congress is competing with one another. The two houses of Congress are competing with one another, not only to cut off aid to the Palestine Authority, which has been prescribed in both versions of the House, but one version is even trying to close up the loopholes that would allow the president to exercise his authority to waiver. So again, all eyes are back on the prime minister and the cabinet. The IDF is doing as much as it can, as best as it can under the circumstances, but Mr. Netanyahu needs to make up his mind and articulate what the strategy is.
We're going to hear now from the IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner. Peter, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning, guys.
Could you give us the latest? Of course, we have had code red sirens from yesterday evening in the center of Israel and also this morning. Obviously, yesterday you called it an inconvenience that Israeli citizens might have to live through despite any kind of redeployment and unilateral withdrawal. Is this still the case today, or is there a new assessment?
Yeah, good morning. Over the night, the IDF continued its activities and continued to strike Hamas. Indeed, they still have rocket capabilities and some 3,000 rockets, but we have seen a slight decline in rocket launching over the recent days. Yesterday we did see a peak, and it perhaps has something to do with our regrouping and redeployment on the field. The IDF is continuing its activities, and indeed we still have forces on the ground. Overnight we demolished 2 more tunnels, and we have to see indeed how this is developing. The troops on the ground, those that have been taken out of the Gaza Strip, are currently in the border areas and taking time to regroup and prepare for next stages as things develop.
And of course, Peter, when looking at the truce that has been declared by the IDF unilaterally, what does that mean in terms of defensive operations? If the IDF is encountering fire, what will it do?
Well, naturally, we will continue to operate. The activities on the ground will, and the ceasefire, the humanitarian window, which we have declared, it will take place between 10 o'clock and 5 o'clock today. Does not include the areas where the military is still present. So we will be defensive everywhere else, but it actually means that the people will be able to, Palestinians in Gaza, will be able to resupply, deal with the medical issues. That's the situation. We're hoping that, contrary to recent times where we've had these humanitarian windows,
right,
it won't be abused and exploited by Hamas to carry out more attacks.
And yesterday we were talking about the UNRWA school shelling and calling it maybe perhaps a tipping point, also diplomatically for Israel, but maybe also militarily. What is the latest in terms of the IDF's own investigation on what exactly happened there?
So here's what we know. The IDF was targeting a group of Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists that were on a motorbike speeding through the area of Rafah. Indeed, we struck them and we hit our target, and it seems in the aftermath that there was some explosion there, potentially causing the damage, but we still have not been able to determine that is the situation. It exemplifies the challenges we have in the urban warfare, especially in areas like Gaza, where it is so densely populated. And when you hit a legitimate target, when you strike them, it's hard sometimes to determine where they are, especially if it's a moving target. That is what we will be investigating. Indeed, could have been carried out different, and we have succeeded better, perhaps striking elsewhere. We will be investigating that and looking into it to try and learn and for future incidents and perhaps and limit civilian impact in the future.
Peter, we have a question here from studio from the Bureau Chief of Defense News, Barbara Opel-Rome.
Peter, hi, good morning. Could you tell us what the situation is in terms of the number of enemy combatants that the IDF has managed to take out in the past 48 hours? And also, as far as the IDF assesses, is that tunnel threat now taken care of, or do you maintain your right to respond readily as intelligence comes up with new information?
Well, we know what we know, and we have, as far as the tunnels are concerned, we've progressed quite well. Indeed, two more tunnels were demolished overnight, and the progress is ongoing, and we'll continue as far as we can succeed. And indeed, we have capabilities and ongoing activities in order to try and expose more. As far as the encounters that we've had over the last perhaps 24 hours, we've had several face-to-face encounters with Hamas terrorists. Yesterday during the day, while we were detonating a tunnel, we noticed some terrorists coming out of the tunnel, tank rounds engaged and struck. In the central Gaza Strip, another incident with tanks that fire light weapons, automatic weapons were firing at a tank. Of course, we responded there and took them out. Also in the central Gaza Strip, the paratroopers brigade was engaged with 4 terrorists that were trying to shoot an anti-tank missile. The force responded, 4 dead terrorists in that. And indeed, overnight, had several activities. One of them, Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Peter, instead of getting in such a very high resolution, can we ask?
What I can say perhaps is just to show, it's quite hard to convey the extent of the engagement. And sometimes when we use the term terrorist organization, people get into their mind 3 or 4 terrorists coming out, carrying out an attack and coming back. What we've encountered is battalions of these terrorists in a semi-military type formation with a clear leadership, with equipment, with some sort of level of discipline that we've been meeting them on the battleground. I would say we have hundreds of these terrorists that have been killed in action. They definitely don't feel free to operate on the ground. Yeah, that's
what I wanted to ask. What is the IDF's response? You know, the Palestinian Ministry of Health has the latest death toll, 1,680, I believe.
1,800.
1,800. Can the IDF give some type of context to that, knowing full well that human shields, that's their doctrine, cynical use of humans, but still, what can the IDF claim that 40% of that number are indeed legitimate targets, were indeed legitimate targets, 30%, 50%, what? Where are we here?
First of all, be extremely cautious in embracing any figures that are coming out of the mouths of Hamas Ministry of Health, which is a Hamas Ministry of Health.
They've been quite accurate in previous occasions.
They've been feeding. No, right? They have. We've seen several instances where they have been extremely inaccurate. But I would say, first of all, let's be cautious about embracing those figures. I've heard different figures from different commanders that I've been speaking to in the field and in our headquarters, and I really wouldn't want to determine how many. Indeed, the civilian toll is heavy in this type of warfare. It is, we do not intentionally target civilians.
Right.
But the type of warfare, the asymmetrical warfare, is not only a fact of how you meet them on the battlefield, it's also of one body utilizing all of the rules and regulations to try and mitigate and limit its civilian impact, and the other side, the terrorists, which are using civilian using the rules of warfare to exasperate those.
Right.
So while I can't give a specific figure, and indeed we don't do a body count when we kill terrorists, we don't line them up and count them. We are engaging. There is extensive battles over the last 2.5 weeks with the ground force activities. We feel that we have dealt a severe blow to those battalion-like formations
Right.
in Beit Lahia, in Sajaiya, in Han Yunis, in Rafah, and other places. We have struck the leadership or the mid-range leadership, those that are responsible for the command and control, those that have oversight on several operations.
Right.
And indeed other capabilities like rockets and the tunnel warfare. So it's a huge mission, and indeed they have instructed everybody that's been killed, no matter who they are, to say that they are civilian. So it is a huge challenge, and it is part of the warfare over the narrative. It's hard to determine, and I don't have hard facts to say this is the exact figure.
Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, thank you for joining us this morning. Of course, the IDF spokesperson. Arad, looking at hearing Peter Lerner's statements here, and of course looking at the facts of the ground, it's pretty clear that the aftermath of this Operation Protective Edge is not going to be favorable for Israel, and not only in the international community, perhaps not in international law, because it's going to be hard to differentiate, as he said, the body count of terrorists versus civilians.
Well, I still stick to what I told Peter, that in previous occasions the Hamas figures, or the figures that came out of Gaza, were quite accurate. After the end of the battle, the figures correlated nearly 100%, the IDF figures and the Gaza Ministry of Health figures. And we don't know yet exactly the differentiation.
Meaning there's going to be another Goldstone.
There is going to be another investigation. The UN Human Rights Council has declared already that it is going to investigate war crimes committed by Israel. Now, not committed by Hamas, but committed by Israel. I know that there are lots of preparations for the judicial war that will come after the war within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Justice. They are preparing. Eventually, they say that every military operation is covered by a judicial umbrella. They check it with lawyers. They have lawyers that accompany the combatants, so to speak. So the Israeli side prepares for that day, but unfortunately it seems that we are not nearly there. The battle is ongoing and there's no end in sight. Israel tries to stop it unilaterally, but the other side carries on.
We just heard from Peter Lerner that he cannot quantify, even by percentage. Is it 30% of the 1,860 or so Palestinian fatalities? That is harming the Israeli narrative. When they have a colonel on background that can't even provide even estimates, whereas the Palestinian Ministry of Health is listing names and ages and locations. For goodness sake, the IDF has enough information to phone them on the telephone, on their home phone, on their cell phone, and send them text messages. And they don't have enough information at this point to boost their narrative, which we want to believe their narrative, and there's ample evidence to support their narrative, but their lack of forthcomingness at this point is very disconcerting. And may I just say, we finished 4 weeks of warfare here in Operation Protective Edge. Israel, the IDF, has lost nearly 5 times as many soldiers. And these are not just simple newly drafted 19-year-olds. I mean, every death is a tragedy. But these are officers. These are seasoned professionals. And this is a heavy, heavy toll. And if we take the cast-lead figures, and what you said, Arad, is so true. I mean, if the Palestinians claimed 1,400 or some casualties in cast-lead, and Amnesty International had a little bit lower, and the IDF claimed 1,100, but at least at the end of the day, when the dust was settled, it was claimed that 700 or so enemy combatants were killed, almost half.
I think it also goes back to a problem that always comes up in Israeli military operations, is that the IDF has a monopoly on the information coming out basically from Israel. The foreign ministry is involved in the messages, but not substantially. Most of the spokesmen are IDF spokespersons, and they control the information. They don't get too many challenging questions from the Israeli media regarding the numbers. I don't think we hear a lot of questions like Barbara here was confronting Mr. Lerner, Major General Lerner earlier.
He'd love to be a Major General.
Well, Lieutenant General, excuse me. But they control the information, and that is the information that is coming out. There's not enough thought about the diplomatic face of this and about how much important there is an improvement. They've been very good with the videos. They've been very good with the VTRs, but they control it. Social media. It's all coming out from them. And just notice that because of political reasons, and it's a political reason, the Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman is not part of the decision making throughout the whole operation. Some might say that's for the good, but in any case, you do know that the diplomatic interests are not represented all the time and not constantly represented all the time, even though the Israeli Prime Minister will say that he is the one thinking about it all the time. But these questions about image and narratives are, you get a feeling they're not really persistent on the top level all the time.
But even beyond the image and narrative and the numbers, the growing numbers that will have to be explained, what also will have to be explained is the military achievements. And it seems to be, to me, I have been speaking to the IDF spokesperson throughout, that even his military achievements that he's giving to the Israeli population are not perhaps convincing to the home front itself. Have we actually, weakened Hamas? Are the rockets going to be decreased and so forth?
This is the conundrum. There have been enormous operational achievements. Defense, we don't have to even mention the Iron Dome and the more than 500 intercepts and the ability to calculate.
But that's defensive.
That's defensive. But these targeting operations, for the first time on a persistent basis, the IDF has been able to regenerate what they call their bank of targets. In Lebanon, after the first few days, they did the Dakhya, they depleted their target bank. Cast-lead pillar of defense was a little bit better, but now every single day they're generating new targets. Now, how well they strike them, they don't say X number of facilities were destroyed. They said the IDF engaged I think it's more than 4,300 targets lately. They don't say what is the bomb damage assessment. They don't give exact locations where they have struck. But I do know for a fact that in addition to the extraordinary defensive measures, not only the active defense provided by the Iron Dome, there's active defense around the tanks this time. The APCs is a totally different story, but there's active defense of the troops in the field, and they're doing amazing operations.
But the problem is that this does not console any of the residents of the southern Israel. The people in Ashdod are still running 2 to 3 times a day into shelters. The people around Gaza are under a constant threat. So. Okay, we are having a wonderful military achievements, but we didn't bring peace to the region.
And we can't convey it.
I'm not. Peace is the wrong word here.
Quiet.
We did quiet. Yes, we didn't bring quiet to the region. Nothing has changed. So, I mean, what good is there in these achievements?
And this is a bit of cynicism here, but it's tragically true. The IDF, the government of Israel, is first and foremost protecting its assets. So they developed under a lot of pressure. Finally, they were able to develop and fund this capability that is now defending air bases, critical strategic targets, and major population centers, primarily in the center of the country. The mortar threat, that very short range that these miskinim, these poor people that are living in the Gaza envelope, there would have been a defense available. The technology exists, but the decision was made. The priority was such that these civilians are running to shelters every half an hour or so, and that's a shame.
And I'm going to just remind us all, it was labeled yesterday by the IDF spokesperson as an inconvenience that we might have to just continue and live with. We're going to take a short break, of course, to go to the headlines. But first, Tal, I just want to quickly remind us, yesterday Channel 2 published a survey, a very interesting survey. We've been looking at Netanyahu's popularity throughout. What would you give us the numbers and a quick analysis of what that means for the political implications of this campaign?
Well, first of all, the 56% of according to the Channel 2 poll, 56% of the Israeli public opposed the unilateral withdrawal of the IDF forces. But the most interesting figure is that Netanyahu is slowly losing support in the public. And 2 weeks ago, he was at around 80%. Last Thursday, he was on 74%. And yesterday was 62% approval rates. This is, of course, a reflection of what Arad has been describing. In many ways, people do feel that no solution has been created here, especially not for the residents of the South. They do not feel that there is that there has been a tough enough approach. And of course, Netanyahu has had many political contenders who are happy to jump on the wagon and slam him for not being tough enough. And this is what we're seeing reflecting in the polls. I do not think...
They haven't been quiet, of course, yesterday as well, all these contenders.
Well, some of them, Lieberman and Bennett are behind, probably criticizing behind closed doors. Gideon Sa'ar, his own Likud minister contender, he's now making a lot of noise, and he'll probably be punished for that.
One more proof that Israeli public opinion is one of the most fragile, fickle things around.
Fickles. Yeah. We're talking about ourselves here. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to go quickly to the I-24 news desk for more headlines, and we'll be back with another hour of this special broadcast. Good morning, and thank you for staying with us here at I-24 News Morning Edition. It is the 28th day of Operation Protective Edge. Israel has declared a 7-hour humanitarian truce for today across the Gaza Strip, except for East Rafah. It is set to take hold at 10 a.m. and end at 5 p.m. Meanwhile, the Hamas spokesperson, Sami Abu Zuhri, responded to the IDF's declaration of the truce, saying it's a unilateral act which is designed to, quote, divert attention from Israel's acts of slaughter. Meanwhile, Israel was slammed for allegedly striking an UNRWA school, killing 10. The IDF said it fired on terrorists on motorcycles near the school and that it was looking into the incident. The IDF has also partially redeployed in and around Gaza as it neared the end of its work demolishing Hamas tunnels. And of course, yesterday, a Palestinian delegation held talks on the ceasefire arrangements in Egypt. Here in Israel, the Givati Brigade officer Hadar Golden, killed in Gaza on Friday morning in a Hamas attack, was laid to rest. He was the 64th IDF fatality. Meanwhile, Gazan health officials put the death toll there at some 1,800. With me this hour is Foreign Affairs Editor, Channel 2, for Channel 2, of course, Arad Nir. Thank you for staying with us. The Intelligence and Security Expert, Yossi Melman. Yossi, thank you for being here. And the Middle East Bureau Chief of Russia Today, Paula Slyer. Paula, thank you for being here. We're going to take a quick look first on the work of foreign journalists in the Gaza Strip, and then we'll chat afterwards.
Caught between the warring sides on the one hand and their desire to deliver accurate reports to their audience on the other, foreign correspondents are going through some difficult days in the Middle East. As professional reporters, they are obligated to a code of ethics, but once in a while they find themselves facing some crucial dilemmas on the battlefield and beyond. Last Friday, 2 New York Times reporters, Isabel Kirshner and Farich Akram, reported that their newspaper was asked by the Israeli military censor to submit details about missing soldier 2nd Lieutenant Hadar Goldin. This is not the first time journalists have been asked to obey a gag order, but these orders come usually from the journalist's homeland. However, this may be the journalist's smallest problem. Ever since Operation Protective Edge began, the correspondents have too often found themselves a target of both sides. The main example is the Qatar-based network Al Jazeera. On July 22, the Al Jazeera crew had to evacuate their office in Gaza City after it had reportedly been fired on.
We feel that what happened was meant to be against Al Jazeera offices because the two bullets hit the office at the same time and from the side where we have the lives. There were no casualties, but minor damages. But we will continue working and to send our professional message. We are professionals in covering the events in Gaza. We show the truth and reality as it is.
Israel, on the other hand, accused Al Jazeera for an anti-Israeli cover, which sometimes turned into a propaganda. Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman even called to ban the channel in Israel. The threats, of course, do not just come from the Israeli side. In 2007, BBC correspondent Alan Johnson was kidnapped by Muslim militant group Army of Islam in Gaza and was released only 4 months later.
I've been dressed in what is an explosive belt, which the kidnappers say will be detonated if there's any attempt to storm this area.
But despite all this, many journalists are not afraid to report inside the enclave, as their professional career and prestige is on the line.
Paula, you of course cover the region for Russia Today, and you could probably relate to many of perhaps the guidelines that foreign journalists in the Gaza Strip have to obey by. From your experience as a foreign journalist here in this region, how hard is it to perhaps objectively convey what is happening now in the Gaza Strip, especially since Israeli journalists and me and my colleagues are not allowed to go in and cover the situation?
I think it's very hard to cover this conflict. I think journalists on both sides face constraints, but of course the constraints that a journalist faces in Israel is different to the constraints foreign journalists face inside Gaza. The figures we have are that around 200 foreign correspondents are currently working in Gaza. Many of them, and this is from speaking to my colleagues, face some kind of self-censorship, and this is because of the limitations that are placed on them by Hamas. I can tell you that from my news organization RT, our correspondent who was based in Gaza was kicked out a few days ago, and the reports were allegedly that he had tweeted that Hamas was firing rockets from nearby the hotels where the foreign correspondents were staying. So certainly there is some kind of self-censorship in the sense that you don't want to be kicked out. You know that if you say something that the Hamas don't agree with, not only do you risk being kicked out, but you could potentially be targeted. There have been journalists who say that they felt that their lives were threatened. At the same time, the other problem, if you like, is that you're in the midst of a conflict where the destruction, devastation, and the death toll climbs around you almost daily. And I think in that way, the other self-constraint is to try not to become too embedded inside the story, not to empathize too much with the suffering and the destruction and the death that you see around you. And I mentioned at the beginning constraints that we face inside Israel. I think it's the same kind of challenge. I think very often the correspondents who are inside Israel, and you mentioned Israeli journalists can't go inside Gaza, it's a very fine line between telling the story and being even unconsciously caught up in the sentiment and the feeling and representing the people that you interview, because obviously you only have access to them. The access you have to the other side is not from personal experience, so it's always going to be that much more further removed. But
Can you compare the constraints that a journalist faces in Gaza to do his job to the constraints that a journalist has in Israel to do his job?
Not on the level in which you're asking me. I don't think that there's any kind of pressure, certainly, that's being placed on journalists inside Israel from the Israeli government or the Israeli army in the way that they are being placed on by Hamas. The constraints, perhaps it's the wrong word. It's more kind of an internal kind of objectification. It's a challenge for us as journalists in the sense that we are human beings and we see the conflict from the perspective of where we're standing. And I can, and this is just a personal answer, I can see in my reporting I have to constantly question myself. Am I saying something that is too sympathetic of the Israeli public?
Maybe it's because of the organization you're working for.
Not necessarily. I think it's a challenge that we face as journalists. I mean, it might not be something that you face as an Israeli journalist, but as a foreign correspondent, we have to talk to our constituency. And I'm receiving hate mail. I'm receiving hate mail in terms of trying to put across the Israeli point of view. And that hate mail, I'm not saying it's necessarily a guide, but I'm saying it is almost something that I have to monitor. Am I representing the Israeli point of view?
I receive hate mail all the time, and I simply ignore it. It doesn't influence my work.
But at the same time, every media house has to talk to its constituency. And if our constituency
so that's why the Israeli reporters are talking to their constituency, which is the Israeli public.
What is the constituency of RT?
The constituency of RT is a foreign audience that is quite anti-West, so is going to be automatically more empathetic and more sympathetic to the Palestinian side of the story. So the challenge I face as, let's say in this particular story, I'm their correspondent based in Israel and they have another correspondent based in Gaza, the challenge that I face is to tell the Israeli story, but not tell it in such a way that it doesn't reflect the suffering, the devastation and the reality of what's happening on the ground in Gaza.
But Israeli journalists do the same.
But that doesn't mean it's right. I'm just saying that this is the challenge that I face.
I don't see any challenge. Israeli journalists are covering the conflict from both sides. I mean, they don't have access there. They are not present there. But if you look at the Israeli media, especially the English-speaking media, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, other English websites, they report the stories as they are.
But
now you try to hide you try to put aside your personal feelings. Of course, I'm an Israeli. I served in the military. I'm a Zionist. I love my country, but it doesn't interfere with my professional work.
But on the other side, Yossi, maybe, and this is a criticism that we've heard from the international media, is that the Israeli society, and Arad can attest to this as a journalist on TV, doesn't really get the full picture of what's happening in Gaza because perhaps A, we don't have journalists in there, and B, there is some kind of this commitment to the constituency.
Mainly because of the narrative. You know, we in the mainstream Israeli media, we stick to the Israeli narrative. The percentage of time that we allocate to the information coming from Gaza about what's happening in Gaza is very, very limited. And this is why I claim, since this whole began, and in previous occasions, previous conflicts, I always claimed it, that the Israeli public does not have enough information on what is being done on behalf of its name. And
but on the
this also disrupts the possibilities of the political people, of the politicians, to take the proper decisions, bearing in mind the public reaction.
But on the personal level, are you censored if you bring a story to your channel about the devastation, destruction in Gaza? You are not prevented of publishing it.
I'm not prevented, but I get much less airtime than what's happening here, which is not in correlation to the amount of devastation.
Which is the same question you leveled at me. I mean, I'm not saying it necessarily comes from the same source, but you're also saying that there is some kind of constraints in terms of how the story is presented in particular media channels. My personal censorship, I'm not saying necessarily that I have it. I say that it's a challenge. And I stand by that statement. I think it's true for every journalist that each of us has to constantly look at our personal censorship, and it comes from where we're reporting the story. I think inevitably correspondents that are based in Israel, that are reporting here for year after year after year, that are experiencing this conflict from within the Israeli public, the Israeli fear, the Israeli hysteria, in inverted commas, have to challenge themselves that they don't get caught up in that on an emotional level.
Yeah, but I think that the main difference between covering what's happening in Gaza from Gaza to covering what's happening in Israel from within Israel is that in Gaza you are not free, you cannot report freely on what's happening. We received various testimonials from various journalists that came out of Gaza claiming that they are under constant pressure of Hamas, especially in these days. I don't know when you've been to Gaza and what did you experience when you personally have been there. But some international media correspondents have had very, very disturbing testimonials about the amount of pressure that Hamas exerts on them reporting the information from there. And this is extremely troubling because this put some pressure on me reporting what's going on in Gaza, because I'm not there, I cannot go in there, and maybe even if the Israeli authorities would let me in, I'm not sure that the Hamas will let me out after I go in there. And if someone in Hamas hears me and is willing to vow for my life, if I come in there, I'll be happy to go into Gaza and see with my own eyes what's going on there and be free to report about what I see in my own eyes.
I completely agree with those statements, if you don't mind me coming in. It's certainly what I'm being told by my colleagues in Gaza. There's a lot of intimidation, there's a lot of pressure put on them in terms of the story that can come out. But I want to say parallel, and I'm not trying to excuse what's happening with Hamas, but there is the flip side of the coin, and that is speaking to my colleagues who work in Gaza, particularly those who are Gazans themselves, they feel that they are targeted by the Israeli army. Again, I'm not refuting your argument, I'm just saying it parallel to it. They feel that media houses are seen as legitimate targets by the Israeli army. There have been at least 4 media houses to date that have been targeted. The journalists themselves feel that wearing a protective shield that says press does not in any way protect them. And if you look at international law says that journalists should be protected regardless of whether they are seen as being part of, in inverted commas, a propaganda tool, which is what Israel uses as a justification for targeting Hamas's radio and television outlets. So journalists in Gaza face this difficulty of pressure from both sides.
Yeah, I actually presented this particular question to the IDF authorities, and the answer was that the media outlets are not targeted per se, but Hamas is using same locations where the media is located in order to launch rockets and for some command centers, etc., and they are being targeted. That's the official answer from Israel.
Hamas is using foreign reporters as a human shield as well.
That's
part of my other question is, of course, is how does the Israeli military show its achievements throughout this 28 days of war? And it's going to have to explain itself, of course, that we spoke in the last hour of the amount of casualties on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side, when there is really no Israeli press there to monitor what's going on. It's very hard, of course, to show military achievements when here in Israel we're hearing reports of code red sirens and so forth, and we don't know what's going on there. We haven't seen it.
Well, the IDF is basically using, if it comes to body counting, it's using the reports of the various international organizations operating in Gaza, especially the various UN agencies, and it considered them pretty reliable. I just yesterday attended the briefing of IDF, and we were asked if they know how many casualties, how many fatalities
are civilian versus
in general in Gaza, and they said we rely on the reporting of the UN agencies. Maybe there are some contradictions between them, but we still take them into account. And then you have the IDF its own counting, which really refers only to combatants. Now, this is problematic because they estimate, for example, that if 1,800 fatalities have been recorded in Gaza since the beginning of the war, 1,800, maybe slightly more, half of it, or 45% of it, are combatants. And it's very tricky and problematic because some of these combatants don't carry weapons. Others conceal their identities.
Right.
Certainly Hamas doesn't present most of its casualties as Hamas members. Then you don't carry a membership, I'm a member of Hamas. So that's the problem of the IDF as far
and also engaging maybe the foreign press that are there. I mean, the IDF is not going to invite foreign press to go with them on the missions to find these tunnels and so forth.
Well, it did. It did to a very limited scale.
Yeah.
I mean, but also Israeli journalists are not allowed to go there except for I think 2-3 days. Some military correspondents joined the various, were embedded to the units.
2 and 3 hours, you mean?
Yes, during 3 days for 3-4 hours each time. I mean, it partly it's for safety reasons and partly because they don't want to see what's going on there.
But I think there's a real problem with embedding journalists, and it goes back to how this discussion started. How do you tell the truth about what's happening in Gaza? On the one hand, you're inside Gaza, and you have the limitations that Hamas puts on you. On the other hand, if you want to get in from the Israeli point of view, you go in embedded with the Israelis and try as you want to be objective. You are seeing it through the Israeli army's point of view.
These embedded reports are not journalism. These embedded reports are sort of bringing out the point of view of the army operation. This is what it is. You can't learn the slightest bit of what's going on in Gaza from these reports. What you can maybe learn is what is the IDF doing within the confinement of what it wants you to know about what it's doing.
Which brings me to the point I want to make. I am a foreign correspondent, but I have real problems with how foreign correspondents, myself included, work today. The first problem is embedded. Often we find the only way we can get into a difficult or dangerous area is by embedding with the army. If not, you either take one side or the other. When I reported in Syria, I went in through the Damascus government permission, working for Russia Today, so it's one perspective. If you don't and you're going with the rebels in Syria, you show another perspective. It's very, very hard today to show both perspectives regardless. Forget the Gaza conflict, in any kind of situation that's happening.
Absolutely.
And the other limitation, sorry Yossi, is just that a lot of foreign correspondents come in, we're almost like news junkies. We parachute in, we tell the story for a week or two in Gaza, and we leave. And I think what we as foreign correspondents lack often is context, is understanding of the bigger conflict. It's something that Israeli journalists have, but unfortunately you don't have the ability to go into Gaza. So maybe the truth of what's happening is somewhere between all of us.
Well, it happens all over the world. I mean, especially with modern Western armies. Look what the Americans did during the invasion of Iraq.
Right.
Certainly the Russians are not allowed to cover their military operations unless they bring their own journalists. They're trusted journalists, and the British press more or less is following the same line. Look, I was a foreign correspondent in London in the early 90s. I'm that old. So, I mean, there was a war 3,000 miles away, the Falklands War.
Right.
And the British journalists were stuck actually with the British Navy, and there was a heavy censorship because they had to use the communication gear of the ships.
Right. Of the 90s.
and they cut, and sometimes the BBC were cut off in the middle of the broadcast because someone was shouting, "You are not allowed to say it. You are not allowed to say it." So it happens all the time. I mean, and then the parachute, the phenomena of parachuting journalism is a problem. Is a problem. You go in for one day. You talk to the local taxi driver who tells you what he thinks about the situation, and that's become a source. Yeah, that's right.
Yossi, we're going to have to break very soon, but just as Israel says it's going to unilaterally withdraw, there is this kind of dissonance between what the military said is achieved and what is perceived here in Israel. What is your perception of this, the achievements, quote unquote, and is it as maybe as grand as the IDF is presenting it today?
I agree with the IDF statement. Perception that the goals assigned by the cabinet to the IDF were achieved. These were the destruction of the tunnels.
It was also quiet, though. They also said quiet.
Okay. And to inflict as much damage as possible and reduce the rocket arsenal of Hamas. That's also to a certain degree. It's less measurable, but to a certain degree it has been achieved. Thirdly, to bring peace and quiet to the region, to the rural communities in southern Israel, it still has to be seen. And then they talk about this elusive term of deterrence. We will see if deterrence has been reached and achieved, and we will see it in, let's say, in 3, 4, 6 months if there is a quiet and peace in the region.
Okay, well, we'll have to, I guess, wait and see, of course. Meanwhile, there are code red sirens all morning here in Israel.
Just remind us all that in order to deter someone, there's someone that has to be deterred.
Exactly.
And meanwhile, it seems that the Hamas is not deterred.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to I-24 News Morning Edition. Thank you for staying with us. It is day 28 of Operation Protective Edge, and we are in a special broadcast this morning. With me still in studio is Middle East Bureau Chief of Russia Today, Paula Slyer. Paula, thank you for staying with us. And I-24 News correspondent Gabi Tartakovsky. Gabi, you'll be here soon with some headlines. And also with me is the co-CEO of Ruveni Pridan Advertising, Niv Choresh. Niv, thank you for being with us. We're going to go soon to get an update from the Israeli-Gaza border. But before I do want to start with you, Niv. You have, and your PR and advertising firm, have started a new campaign. Tell us a bit about the campaign, what the motive was behind this campaign.
Actually, the campaign called Save the Children of Gaza from Hamas. I hope that we can see it. We are located in the middle of Tel Aviv, and at least once a day we find ourselves during work. Everybody leave the computer and run to the shelter, and I can see the anxiety in the eyes of people, especially parents, and we felt that we have to act. And we thought that the most painful issue in this war is the children of Gaza. Actually, they suffer. And the fact that Hamas, the terror organization, use them as human shields and take the money that's supposed to invest in schools and daycares and hospitals for kids and use it for terror tunnels and for rockets. So we felt that the world should know, and we made this movie and this campaign.
Let's take a quick look at this short clip at the campaign.
أمضي على طريقه أصارع الأعداء
So Niv, watching this campaign, obviously, as an Israeli, it sends the message home to me. But who is the target audience when thinking about this campaign?
Actually, it's the people of the world, Americans, Europeans, Palestinians, everyone who feel that using children for terror is wrong, and I hope that is everyone.
How many people have you already reached, and what have been the reactions?
We reached only through the internet, YouTube and Facebook more than 1 million people. 40% of them are Europeans and Americans, 40% are Palestinians.
Do you know it's an Israeli agency behind this?
We didn't put our logo there, but no, actually, no, they don't know. You know, it's something that we want them to experience without knowing that it's Israel.
And what have been the reactions? I'm sure there's also, I mean, anytime anyone says anything about this conflict, to one side you get both sides.
Thousands of reactions. Some of them are violent and harsh, and some of them are supportive. But what's more interesting is that it creates very interesting conversations between Palestinian and Israelis. A lot of disagreement, a lot of anger, but for us it's a very important channel. And we have 200 Palestinians that are members in our Facebook page now. And we hope that in times of peace we can share some creative ideas.
Creative ideas for future campaigns.
Future
now we're talking corporate.
Yeah.
But also in times of conflict and hardship, how influential would you say is this PR campaign? We were talking before in the earlier segment about how the IDF tries to portray its message through social media and so forth. How influential are PR companies, advertising companies, during times of conflict?
It's a complicated question. I mean, the influence is not very strong, but if you can reach even one person in another country, a person that talks with his family and his friends, so for us it's important. The picture that we see from Gaza are actually the proof for what we said in our campaign, because you can see they're using the children in hospitals and in schools and everywhere. So it's hard to compete this picture, but I think that it's complete the picture.
We're going to get a quick update now from our I-24 News correspondent, Charles Biebelzer. Charles, you're on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning. What's the latest from there?
Relative quiet, Yael, but it may be deceiving. As you know, the IDF continues its activities in and against the Gaza Strip. Even as it begins to withdraw its troops, forces remain actively engaged in southern Gaza, primarily targeting the tunnel infrastructure there. As well, over the last 24 hours, some 100 targets have been struck in Gaza, both by land and air. On the flip side, rockets continue to be launched into Israel. This morning, Ashkelon and Ashdod were targeted, and yesterday, Tel Aviv was targeted again. All of this is to say that in the absence of any durable ceasefire agreement or a commitment by both sides to end the hostilities, flare-ups can and even should be expected throughout the day. And in spite of Israel's unilateral declaration of a humanitarian ceasefire.
Right, this declaration of ceasefire is due to come in less than 25 minutes. And the IDF has said this morning that it will be responding defensively to any opening of fire on its troops during this time. Have you seen or heard any explosions since this morning?
Actually, we did hear one artillery shell fired into the Gaza Strip from without. And about 30 minutes ago, we also did see a plume of smoke emanating from Gaza. We can't confirm whether one was related to the other, but the IDF, as I said, is continuing its activities. The government is committed to doing so. So there will be activity, and it should be expected.
Charles Biebelzer, I-24 News correspondent there on the Israeli-Gaza border. Thank you for that update. Of course, Paula, when looking at these ceasefires, I think one of the most, if you look at it cynically almost, it's been broken each and every time. And this is also a game of narratives, as also for you as a foreign journalist and also for the international media as a whole. Who's to blame each time, and what side do you take?
I mean, you're certainly correct, and there's almost the cynicism, not only amongst foreign journalists, I think amongst everybody who's following the story. Will a new ceasefire hold? I remember when the first ceasefire was announced, I can talk for me working for RT, it was headlines and there was a lot of furore and there was a lot of attention placed to it, and then we were almost doing the same story every couple of days or even every couple of hours. I think most of the mainstream media is trying to cover these ceasefires as much as they can and as objectively as they can, and they are trying to attribute blame as to where blame is meant to be attributed. What a lot of foreign journalists are doing is quoting the United Nations and international organizations when attributing blame. So, for example, if the UN says that it was Hamas that is held responsible, they tend to take that line rather than actually push their own agenda. That's a general statement. Of course, there are publications that will consistently blame Israel for breaking ceasefires, and there are those that will blame Hamas. But certainly, it's almost as if one can tell the story of a ceasefire before it even happens. One can almost say, well, this ceasefire is unlikely to last long, and that's how we're reporting the stories. We're reporting the fact that a ceasefire is happening with question marks that we weren't doing when the first ceasefires were announced, whenever it was, a couple of days ago.
The biggest conflict of the ceasefires as a whole, and I'm going to pinpoint one, was the one on Friday. Of course, the last weekend when Hadar Goldin was kidnapped and thus murdered. And that was the big question of where Israeli troops were at the time. What line had they crossed? Were they actually implementing what their part of the agreement was yes, they can continue dealing with the tunnels, while Hamas said no, they didn't agree to that part. How do you know what is the exact truth afterwards, and how do you present, who broke the ceasefire?
It's a very, very difficult question to answer, and I made some notes of how different publications covered it. I mean, for example, the Telegraph blamed Israeli tanks for killing 4 Palestinians as the main cause of the breach of that ceasefire. The Independent blamed Israel for shelling just hours after the ceasefire began. But then you had a publication like Al Jazeera, which focused on how the US blamed Hamas for the breach of the ceasefire. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. Because sometimes these things are happening so quickly and we don't immediately have independent verification of what is happening on the ground, some media outlets are still announcing that the ceasefire has happened when it's already been broken, and the information that 3 soldiers, or at that time it was 2 soldiers, had been kidnapped and 1 had gone missing, is all coming at the same time. It's so difficult to stay on top of the story and know where to begin to blame the ceasefire being broken and where to begin your reporting of the violence. And also the time is so fast, and sometimes it's early in the morning. I think that was all happening quite early in the morning, that by the time the information comes through and is fact-checked and disseminated, we can often make mistakes, and we can often miss the breaking of a ceasefire or who broke it because we're already reporting the new part of the story.
I want to bring into this conversation right on this point Jonathan Sacerdoti, our I-24 News correspondent there in London. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Yael.
Of course, part of the narrative on the international media has, of course, been trying to stay objective as possible. But on this issue of ceasefires, of course, it really does change from publication to publication. And Paula gave a pretty good review of the British papers. How would you see the last few days, and especially today, while Israel is going to be calling now for a unilateral ceasefire, how is it covered in the British press?
There's a real mix. The news pages, of course, are covering what we'd expect, these images of horrible suffering of the civilians in Gaza. But then we have some of the opinion pages giving us a little more insight. And today's Times has a brilliant insight from Melanie Phillips, the columnist for that newspaper, who tells us that the public is not getting the real truth about Gaza, in her words. She says that innocent civilians will continue to die until the brutal manipulations of Hamas are exposed. And she goes on to detail some of the things that, of course, in the Israeli media and here on I-24 News, we've been discussing at length over the course of the war. But in the UK, these things are less discussed. Those would be issues such as the use of civilians as human shields in Gaza, the lack of photographs of any Hamas fighters in much of the Western press, and then those threats made to the journalists within Gaza when they do dare to question the techniques and strategies of Hamas fighters, and when they do dare to show rocket launchers or whatever. And your other guest there today will be able to tell you that Harry Fear, the Russia Today journalist, was apparently kicked out of Gaza for showing a picture on his Twitter of a rocket launcher near the hotel where journalists are stationed covering the actual engagement in Gaza. So it's those things that Melanie Phillips is drawing attention to in her column in today's Times.
And of course, when you look at the covering, and we did speak about this in our earlier hour here, of how foreign journalists are covering what's going on. And the Washington Post had an interesting article today. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, on 40 questions foreign journalists should be asking when they're covering Gaza. Mainly, of course, how objective can they be when Hamas is the ones ruling or directing their journalism on the ground?
Indeed, that mention in the Washington Post was started, in fact, on a British blog called Harry's Place, a brilliant online repository of articles of that sort, and it was then reproduced in that paper. And those 40 questions have been shared many hundreds of thousands of times on Facebook, around 600 plus times on Twitter, I'm told, by the Washington Post author there. And those 40 questions are vital, but rather simple seeming questions to ask journalists who are covering Gaza at the moment. But they're not being asked very much of those journalists. And so Melanie Phillips here in the Times is perhaps asking some of them, and that is starting to spread now as we're entering a sort of later stage of the engagement. I think it's the case that people are asking why journalists aren't showing certain things from the Palestinian side, why we never see any Palestinian militants, when we do know that they must be fighting very fiercely with the Israeli soldiers who are dying in larger numbers than maybe some expected. So we know that these things are happening, but we're not seeing them in the reports here in the Western media, and we need to know why the journalists there are doing that. Many are trying not to blame the journalists, and in fact saying instead that they have no option. While they're in Gaza, they are at the mercy of Hamas themselves. Some reports from, I think, a Spanish reporter said that if you dared to turn your cameras onto Hamas, you ran the risk of being shot yourself.
Right.
And in fact, others have said that when they finally left Gaza, there was a tweet from an Italian journalist saying he was far away from potential Hamas retribution and able to say that he saw that it was actually Palestinian rockets which injured people in a hospital in Gaza. And more moments like that are happening. So on the other hand, in the French newspaper Libération and others have actually pulled articles on their websites or elsewhere because there's been pressure on the individual journalists who published things which are not favorable to Hamas, which have shown some of their operations and some of their strategies. And I think that that's also demonstrated that it's not necessarily something that the journalists in Gaza can do very freely, but it is the job of the editors back home to at least specify that they're not free to report properly, as they would in almost any other war zone.
Right. And Jonathan, while you're here with us, we did speak, of course, earlier about yesterday's shelling of the UNRWA school and the way it has been condemned diplomatically by world leaders from around the world, maybe even unprecedentedly by the U.S. State Department yesterday. We've also heard reports in recent days from the British Parliament of Miliband criticizing very sharply the leadership of the UK for not saying enough.
That's correct. Ed Miliband has accused David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister, of not saying enough, of remaining silent in the face of what he sees as unacceptable levels of Israeli aggression. But David Cameron has remained strong, and despite certain things he said in the past, back in 2006, for example, as the leader of the opposition then, he did condemn Tony Blair's support for Israel's actions in Lebanon. And then later in 2010, once he became prime minister himself, he did refer to Gaza as a prison camp. But since then, he has changed somewhat his outlook, and he stood up very firmly for Israel's right to be engaged in this military action, this time round protecting itself from the rocket fire and the terror tunnels. And that is what Ed Miliband is criticizing him for, because he feels that he's not saying enough to reflect what he sees as public opinion against Israel. Of course, David Cameron hit back with a statement from 10 Downing Street saying that he thought that Ed Miliband was playing politics over such an important issue, and that in fact, maybe he's hinting that Miliband is trying to attract certain voters ahead of the elections coming up, and he believes that taking this position himself is not supportive of Israel, and it's not what he's promised Jewish and Israeli groups in the past, but it is perhaps popular to certain parts of his constituencies that might vote for him in the future elections.
Well, that won't be anything new also in Israeli politics. Everything is used also for political capital and political gain, perhaps. Jonathan Sachidadi, I-24 News correspondent there in London, thank you for joining us this morning. And Gabby, we're off to you. Some headlines from around the world that perhaps we've been missing throughout this constant tit-for-tat headlines. What's going on?
Yes, we're going to still keep our minds set on Britain. The Jerusalem Post reports that Britain is to review arms sales to Israel after criticism of the Gaza war. There is a large heated debate in Britain over the Gaza conflict. There was an interesting piece published in the British Independent over the weekend regarding the UK-Israeli arms sales. According to documents revealed by the Independent, over £42 million were granted to 130 UK defense manufacturers since 2010 alone. A lobbying group called Campaign Against Arms Trades reveals that £10 million were licensed over the past 12 months. And now the British Business Innovation and Skills Department will review all UK export licenses for arms sales to Israel.
Wow. So this is a different watershed in the relations, and we saw this in the weekend between the U.S. Congress and Israel. It did finally go through the payment for Iron Dome, but there was a bit of friction there as well.
Yes, and interestingly enough, the head of the Business Innovation and Skills Department is Vince Cable, who is a prominent Liberal Democrat figure and is in British politics, often having to cope with Nick Clegg's remarks regarding Israel's offensive actions in Gaza as well. So it will be an interesting move to see how he will react and examine the UK arms sales to Israel.
Indeed, and as Jonathan said, it may have also political backdrop to the entire, of course, decision.
Yes. Now skipping ahead to Haaretz.
Okay.
The ex-Treasury head warns of $4.3 billion loss from Gaza offensive. The former Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Finance, Doron Cohen, is projecting a 15 billion shekel loss due to the ongoing military operation. The estimate includes tax revenues between 3 billion shekels and 5 billion shekels, and only some will be actually recouped later. This follows opposing statements by the current Director General and the current Israeli Finance Minister, who claim that this operation will only have a short-term effect on the Israeli economy.
Right.
Cohen begs to differ. He says there will be a repercussion, there will be a portion that will be permanently lost, and you have to take into account war causes economic damage.
Right.
There's no two ways about it,
and
according
as we
to
spoke
Cohen.
yesterday, of course, this hasn't even been declared a war, which also would, in some ways, kind of try to quantify the economic damage. It's still called an operation, which, of course, has its own economic implications as well.
Yes, and money is lost regardless. I mean, people are losing their jobs and businesses, whether it's an operation or a war, but the compensation will be determined according to the official definition.
Indeed. What else?
Moving on, Ynet reports about an unfortunate incident in which an Israeli karate instructor was attacked in Frankfurt, Germany. He was confronted by protesters who said, "We don't want to learn martial arts from a nation of killers." Shai Chai was set to give a karate lesson as part of an international seminar in Frankfurt, Germany, and he was met by Iranian and local protesters. One even tried to pour red paint over his karate uniforms. According to Chai, members of the Iranian delegation and others shouted at him, "You've got blood on your hands. We don't want to learn martial arts from a nation of killers." And even one said, "You made it in this profession on the expense of Palestinian bodies." Now, this incident lasted for about 10 minutes, and the protesters were later ejected from the seminar, and there was an official apology to the Israeli instructor. And the Israeli instructor said, "When we wear the uniforms, we are all brothers and sisters," and he expressed his remorse that people don't acknowledge and appreciate the sportsmanship that karate offers.
Right.
Personally, I think it's kind of risky regarding your political stance to attack a karate instructor.
Yeah,
I think
I would
politics
say-
can be set aside. I mean,
choose your combatants. I mean,
yes, you got to choose your battles. I think that's the first day. That's the first lesson you learn in karate.
And it's interesting that it's happening in Germany. We've spoken a lot about European capitals that have seen very violent protests. Germany was relatively quiet during this time, and we talked about the Bild, the German publishing company that went on a campaign against anti-Semitism, of course. And this is surprising, perhaps, that it's. I mean, you said it was only 10 minutes, but it did reach the headlines.
Yes, and it has a lingering impact after all. I mean,
course.
this kind of incident is an unfortunate one, especially when there is an international seminar and met by Iranian delegations. It could have been something completely opposite and wonderful, and maybe a chance to bridge over differences rather than raging another conflict overseas.
Right. Well, it's bound to continue.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. Energy reports that a Jewish man was detained in Auschwitz for singing "I Believe." Rabbi Rafi Ostrov of Gush Etzion said he was detained last Friday in Auschwitz for singing songs during a tour in the death camp. Police was called, and Rabbi Ostrov was even forced to pay a $350 fine. That's 1,000 zloty. Ostrov claims, "You can't treat a Jewish group like a bunch of tourists. We cried, we had family members who were killed in Auschwitz, and the security shouted at us everywhere we went inside the camp."
Under what grounds was he arrested?
They sang "I Believe" as a moment of tribute. Now, "I Believe" is a famous Hasidic tune. We know it as Israelis as a bit of an up-tempo song, but it was originally composed during the Second World War and was largely associated with the Auschwitz death camp. So they met, formed a circle of singing, and began to perform "I Believe," and they were asked to stop singing and refrain from any kind of these actions. They refused. He was detained, and now he demands an official apology and a refund for the fine he was forced to pay.
I would say that's the minimum. Wow, there's so many symbolic parts of that story here. I don't even know where to start. We're going to get a quick update now from Yoav Borovich, our I-24 news correspondent in the southern city of Ashdod. Yoav, what's the latest?
Good morning, Yael. The latest is that we have 223 rockets launched towards Ashdod since the beginning of Operation Protective Edge. Last one launched towards the city this morning, intercepted above the city by the Iron Dome. Yael, I just came back from the mayor's office here. People are very skeptical towards now the beginning of the humanitarian unilateral ceasefire by Israel. People here really feel that they suffered enough. We're in the center of the city. We almost see no activity, no people around the streets. They really don't know what to do. You know, value of real estate here plummeting. Really no sense of direction, of leadership. The mayor now is touring the city. We'll be trying to reach him later. But overall, really a A lot of tension here with this morning with the rocket launched and with the ceasefire now starting, maybe accepting even more rockets, more mortar shells towards the city, because that's what happened in the latest ceasefires, quote unquote. We'll be here following all developments. Stay with us.
Yoav Borovich, our I-24 News correspondent there. Thank you for that update. Gavi, you have one more headline before we go?
One last thing. You remember Penelope Cruz and Javier Bardem and Pedro Almodovar's open letter? Well, guess who's challenging them? John Voight, the legendary Hollywood actor.
It's like messing with an Israeli karate instructor to mess with John Voight.
Absolutely. He published his own op-ed piece in the Hollywood Reporter saying Cruz and Bardem should hang their heads in shame. They incited anti-Semitism all over the world and are oblivious to the damage they have caused by writing and signing this letter.
But Cruz, Penelope Cruz did come back and reiterate her points. Too late?
So did Bardem, but John Voight is not impressed.
Well, John Voight has been, I think, throughout the past few years, been very supportive of
He's one of the most notable Hollywood conservatives and, by chance, pro-Israel lobbyist.
Pro-Israel lobbyist. So there you go. It goes together. Penelope Cruz, and is it going to hurt her career in any way?
I don't think so. But interestingly enough, John Voight's daughter, a little unknown actress named Angelina Jolie, also released a statement, but she was very cautious, and she said all she hopes is for peace, and if there was any way to bring an end to the conflict, I would do it in a moment. But she didn't take any sides.
I think that's the best way to go around about it. Thank you, Gavi Tartakovsky, Paula Slyer. Thank you for joining us this morning. That's it for today. This was day 28 of Operation Protective Edge. As we said, in about 3 minutes, the humanitarian ceasefire that was unilaterally declared by Israel will go into effect. It's going into effect for the next 7 hours until 5 p.m. Israel time. This, of course, comes after a morning of rockets on southern Israel. We will be updating you throughout the day as the day progresses. Of course, we'll be here again tomorrow. Next up are the headlines from the I-24 News Desk. I'm Yael Wisner-Levy. We'll see you tomorrow.